In a dark corner of the room hung an antique portrait depicting a man in a black tailcoat with eyes that seemed to follow every movement in the room. The evening was quiet and cold, and the wind outside the window created ominous rustles, as if trying to convey something incomprehensible and threatening to the house. The owner of the house, Mr. Gray, felt goosebumps running down his spine as he approached the portrait. His dog, usually restless and noisy, was lying in a corner, shaking and grumbling, as if sensing something she didn't like. Strange things have been happening in the house in the last few weeks. At night, noises came from the kitchen, as if someone was tapping a spoon on the glass. One day, Mrs. Gray heard someone whispering in her ear, but when she turned around, no one was there. The old wall clock in the living room began to strike at the wrong time, either late or a few minutes ahead of time, but only when no one was looking at it. One night, when Mr. Gray was going to bed, he heard a rustle in his bedroom. Waking up in the semi-darkness, he saw a palm print slowly begin to appear on the ceiling, as if an invisible force was trying to leave its mark. His heart stopped in horror as the palm print began to darken and slowly stretch out towards the bed. He tried to scream, but his voice got stuck in his throat. The dog fluttered and barked shrilly, as if sensing the approach of something sinister. She jumped out of the corner of the room and rushed to the door, shaking with fear. Mr. Gray, feeling a storm of emotions, followed the dog, running out of the bedroom. In the hallway, he felt a cold wind that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. As he passed the mirror in the hallway, he suddenly noticed that his reflection was not moving with him. In his reflection, he saw the face of an old woman with eyes glowing with an ominous light. She was smiling a crooked smile, spreading her arms in his direction. Mr. Gray screamed and jumped back, but the reflection remained motionless, only grinning in response to his horror. One day, when Mr. Gray returned home after a long day at work, he found that all the photos on the walls had changed. Where portraits of his ancestors used to hang, there were now images of strangers with gloomy expression. He tried to take off one of the photos, but the frame wouldn't budge, as if it had been glued to the wall by an invisible force. The oddities increased every day. The sounds of footsteps became not only at night, but also during the day, and Mr. Gray felt something invisible pass by him, leaving a chilling trail in the air. His dog, usually a faithful companion, began to avoid some corners of the house, sometimes even howling at the windows, as if trying to warn his master against an unknown threat. Mr. Gray, although skeptical of the supernatural, began to feel that something was wrong in his house. He found old records in the basement that told about the previous owners of the house. Among them was mentioned a woman who, according to legend, was the victim of a ritual murder in the very room where the portrait now stood. Mr. Gray felt that his life was beginning to be controlled by something else that he could not understand and explain. Horrified, Mr. Gray realized that his house had become a space where the boundaries between reality and another, otherworldly entity were blurred. Every night brought new nightmares and strange phenomena that he couldn't rationalize. He often saw shadows floating around the periphery of his vision, heard whispers and calls that made him shudder in incomprehensible fear. One day, when he passed by the mirror in the hallway, his reflection suddenly distorted. Instead of his face, he saw a distorted image of a man with eyes full of hatred and madness. This man was smiling, but his smile was twisted and sinister. The reflection slowly raised its hand and tried to exit the mirror, as if trying to leave its dark prison. Mr. Gray stumbled backwards, but the mirror remained intact, and his reflection returned to its usual image. He felt that his soul and mind were on the verge of destruction, being attacked by unknown forces that sought to capture his essence. The dog continued to bark and howl, becoming hysterical at each new manifestation of evil spirits in the house. One night, when Mr. Gray was already on the verge of exhaustion from sleepless nights and incomprehensible phenomena, something even more terrible happened. He returned home after another day of work, full of anxiety and worry. Upon entering his house, he immediately felt that the air was saturated with tension, as if the space itself was breathing alien energy. Passing by the mirror in the hallway, Mr. Gray saw that his reflection was not moving, as it had been before. Instead, The mirror absorbed his image, as if trying to pull him inside. He tried to move away, but something invisible held him in place. Suddenly, his reflection began to distort, turning into a perverse distortion of his face. Now it was a gloomy appearance with wide, bottomless eyes full of hatred and madness. Horrified, Mr. Gray tried to scream, but no sound came out of his throat. The reflection raised its hand, trying to touch him, as if it wanted to come out of the mirror and become reality. Mr. Gray felt his mind filling with crazy thoughts, filling him with fear and despair. He tore his gaze away from the mirror with difficulty and ran to the corner of the corridor, panting and trembling with horror. In the corner of the hallway, Mr. Gray felt his body paralyzed by fear. He could hear whispers and rustles surrounding him from all sides, as if invisible shadows were gathering towards him, preparing to deliver the final blow. At that moment, the mirror distorted again, and the reflection of the gloomy appearance with bottomless eyes filled the whole room with its malice. The dog that was with him fell silent, falling to the floor and bursting into tears. Mr. Gray tried to run out of the hallway, but his legs refused to move. He felt invisible hands squeezing his throat, making it impossible to breathe and scream. Voices sounded in his ears, choruses of curses and pleas for salvation, sounding like a fateful verdict. The source of the light coming from the woman illuminated the entire room, and the shadows that engulfed the corners began to slowly recede, as if frightened by this light. The woman approached Mr. Gray and gently put her hand on his shoulder. Her touch was warm and soothing, as if she had taken over his fears and pains. Mr. Gray looked at the woman with awe. He couldn't figure out who she was or where she came from, but he felt that her presence was an escape from the darkness that had almost engulfed him. He felt his strength returning, as if this light was healing his soul. At this time, the dog, sensing that the danger was gone, came closer to Mr. Gray and lay down at his feet. She looked at him with devotion and gratitude, as if realizing that Mr. Gray was no longer alone. But suddenly, in the corner of the room where the shadows had not yet completely retreated, something strange happened. Fragments of shadows emerged from the darkness, taking the form of those who had once been part of this house and died in it. These were the ghosts of the previous inhabitants, souls who had not found peace and remained in this world as ghosts of the past. They were slowly approaching Mr. Gray and the Woman of Light. Their faces were sad and distorted with suffering. Their gazes were full of longing and incomprehensible grief. Mr. Gray stepped back in horror, not knowing what to do. But the woman remained steadfast. She raised her hand and began to shine softly, as if creating a bridge of light between Mr. Gray and the ghosts. She spoke in a soft, comforting voice, urging souls to rest and be free from suffering. Ghosts slowed down, stopped, and glancing at Mr. Gray, slowly disappeared into the darkness, disappearing into thin air. The woman turned to Mr. Gray with a smile and, touching his forehead, whispered words that echoed in his mind. His eyes began to slowly close, and he was sinking into a deep, soothing sleep. When Mr. Gray woke up, he found himself in a dark room that did not look like his home. He was lying on a cold, damp floor, with only rough stone walls around him. He tried to stand up, but his body was weak and unyielding. He felt the panic coming over him again and tried to scream, but his voice broke in a hollow echo. He looked around and realized that this was not just a room, but an ancient, underground chamber. There were runes and symbols on the walls that seemed ominous and menacing. There was an altar in the center of the room, on which a single candle burned, its faint light barely dispelling the thick darkness. Struggling to his feet, Mr. Gray began to inspect the camera, trying to find a way out, but it was all in vain. Not a single door, not a single window, only the stone walls that enclosed him in their cold grip. Suddenly, he heard a rustle and turned around. The shadows on the walls began to thicken, taking the form of the very ghosts he had seen before. Their faces were even more distorted and vicious now. They were slowly approaching him, and every step echoed in his mind. In the center of them, surrounded by darkness, stood the same woman. Now her face was devoid of all light and kindness. Her eyes burned with a sinister fire. "You came into my world," she said in a cold, emotionless voice. "Now you will be a part of it." Mr. Gray realized that he had been deceived. The light figure turned out to be just an illusion. trap that lured him into this ancient hell. The ghosts surrounded him, their cold hands gripped his body, and he felt their icy energy draining his life force. The last thing he heard before his consciousness was plunged into endless darkness was a woman's laugh, a laugh full of gloating and triumph. Gray realized that his soul was now forever trapped in this gloomy place, doomed to eternal suffering among other lost souls. No one knew what had happened to Mr. Gray, and his disappearance was just one of the many unsolved mysteries